We're in a very, very strange moment in domestic politics, I think, which is really characterised by parties that are really operating as media machines rather than as political parties. And that's creating some really strange behaviour, perhaps the strangest of which was yesterday's announcement from the Prime Minister that she would be organising a citizens' assembly to discuss climate change. Of course, it's an odd thing to do when you've announced already that you think there should be a price on carbon. So you kind of have your policy, but you just don't want to announce it in an election campaign. And that's kind of where we are at the moment. A couple of parties that are reluctant really to announce policy because in doing so they might have to commit to something, actually take political positions on things, and then you can't have a political party doing that, especially not in the current media cycle, the 24-hour media cycle, which really transforms the way politics works. It's an important thing for Muslims to think about if they're interested in beginning to engage in political life, because had we had this conversation perhaps even 10 years ago, it would have been a very different environment that we're talking about. This one is a much more difficult one. In a way, in an odd kind of way, it's a more conservative political environment because the way that media interacts with politics means that change is actually a very difficult thing to bring about. If you're a real reforming Prime Minister, for example, you have a much harder time selling that now than you used to. And so we have this sort of odd environment which explains the way the political parties are behaving, where it becomes really a staring match and it becomes very much more image-driven. The thing for Muslims to think about is that in an image-driven world and an image-driven political environment, Muslims have an image problem. So how exactly do you go about political engagement in that sort of context? The barriers to participation are out there. At the same time, you have, I think, a continuing but gradually dampening debate within the Muslim communities about whether or not political participation is something that's desirable at all. And so all these factors converge to create an environment where I think, if I'm having to make a prediction, I think suggests that Muslim participation in politics in a formal party-driven kind of way is not about to encounter some kind of huge explosion. I don't think you're seeing a lot of Muslims running into the arms of political parties wanting to get involved that way. Mohammed El-Leissy, who'll be speaking soon after me, I think is an exception. Two questions that arise from that for me. One is whether or not that's a good thing, and the other is whether or not political participation is something you can think of in broader terms. The first one, I guess, I'll leave to you, but the second question about the nature of political participation is something that I think is worth thinking about, because I think for a lot of people who operate at a distance from politics, there is really only one way of engaging with politics, and that is to become a politician. That, I would have thought, in an audience of this calibre, is something that you can immediately spot as being manifestly untrue. What exactly do Muslims sponsor? It's not that we don't have wealthy people in the Muslim community do. It's not that they're not interested in politics. But I think what there is perhaps a lack of recognition that there are ways to influence the political process that are not inherently or immediately political, but are in fact just about engaging in broader society in ways that are powerful. If you're providing a lot of money to political concerns, what you actually buy, whether or not you intend it, is political influence. That will actually work a lot more efficiently than attending a rally. We like rallies, but I think we're perhaps a little deluded if we think that that's the way that's the effective form of political engagement that's going to leave a mark on the country. It feels good. Let nobody in this room deny that going to a rally and shouting something makes you feel good. But in terms of actually affecting the political process, particularly the domestic political process, I think its impact is limited. Far fewer of us are inclined to make a contribution in thought or financially, or even, I would venture to say, at a sort of grassroots community level beyond the boundaries of the Muslim community. We're probably not as likely to do that. Why? Well, there's some very good reasons for that. We have enough problems of our own, and there's a fair bit of work that needs to go into solving those problems, and so we do need people to direct efforts on that. But I wonder, and I guess this is just something for all of us to think about, I wonder whether or not it also has to do with the narrowness of our vision, the way we choose to engage in public life or not. So we have this weird sort of situation where we often, and this is certainly not a universal statement, but we often behave in ways that are, I guess, parochial. We don't really get involved in affecting the political process in really effective ways, but we love to complain about the outcomes of that political process. The other thing that I think bears thinking about, and that's just questions of, what I've discussed so far are just questions of whether or not or how you would, if you wanted to get involved in politics in some way, how you would do that. What might be effective, what might not. But I guess the other question is, and here is what I think the Muslim community really has to start thinking about, because we've tended not really to, a lot of it's been assumed, and that is, if we're going to engage in politics, what's that engagement going to look like in terms of the positions that people take? That for a lot of us, we would like to think of political engagement as something about rallying people behind a cause. What I want to suggest is that that's perhaps not going to be very useful, if it's achievable at all. That it would be much better, really, if you actually want Muslims affecting the political process, to have Muslims in all aspects of political life, associated with all sorts of different parties. The problem with that we would first have to think about and confront as a community, and that is that means you'll have a whole lot of Muslims saying and doing a whole lot of things you don't like. And here you run into a problem, that is the problem of confronting the diversity of Muslim Australia as it stands. And that's something that we internally, I think, probably agree we don't handle terribly well. Now, we're not alone in that. It's always the case that tensions within communities are much stronger and sharper than tensions between them. Muslims will probably always hate each other more than they hate any non-Muslims, and the same is true for Christians. So the question I guess I would ask before we get to actual political engagement and political participation and everything else that implies is, as a community, are we ready to embark upon that project? Have we sort of reached a state internally where we kind of have the resources to handle those internal disagreements? And that's a tricky thing, because if it is true that strong political participation is the sign of a maturing community, then it may well be true that as a very young community, even though Muslims have lived in Australia for a long period of time, but if you look at Muslim Australia, the demographic is very young. It may well be that as a young community we've still got quite a bit of maturing to do before we're actually at the point of being able to engage effectively. And in the meantime, our political engagement will tend to be and in a sense probably has to be, confined to joining protests, rallies and sending on chain emails and things like that.